Some betrayals cut deeper than words ever could. When Tom Mitchell dragged his 12-year-old golden retriever out of his truck on that empty highway, her eyes still trusted him completely, even as he walked away forever. He figured no one would find her on that dusty road outside Cedar Falls, and even if someone did, who would want an old dog with expensive problems? But 2 days later, she was rescued by the last person Tom expected, his own father, Earl, who he hadn't spoken to in 15 years. Earl recognized her immediately because she was Honey, a gift from Tom's late mother years ago. What started as one man's cruelest moment became another man's chance at redemption. How did abandoning a dog bring a broken family back together? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Tom Mitchell's apartment smelled like disappointment and microwave dinners. At 52, he'd learned to measure his life in what he'd lost rather than what remained. The divorce papers still sat in a manila folder on his kitchen counter. 3 months after Linda had taken half of everything that mattered and all of what didn't. The house in Maple Grove was hers now, along with the 2-car garage, the garden she'd never tended, and the future they'd planned but never built. He pushed open the door to his 1-bedroom rental on Elm Street, the kind of place landlords advertised as cozy when they meant cramped. Honey padded slowly behind him, her golden coat dulled with age and her breathing labored from the 3 flights of stairs. She'd been making that wheezing sound for months now, ever since the vet had delivered the news that would change everything. Congestive heart failure, Dr. Martinez had said, his voice gentle but clinical. She's got maybe 6 months, maybe a year if we're aggressive with treatment. The medications alone will run about $300 a month, and that's before we talk about the specialized diet and regular monitoring. Tom had stared at the stack of veterinary bills scattered across his coffee table like accusatory letters. $4,000 in the past 6 months. $4,000 he didn't have, charged to credit cards that were already groaning under the weight of his new reality. His job at Brennan Auto Parts paid the bills barely, but it didn't leave room for the kind of medical care Honey needed. The apartment felt smaller with each passing day, made worse by Honey's presence reminding him of everything he couldn't provide. She'd been a different dog once, back when Tom's life had different possibilities. Margaret had picked her out from a litter of puppies 12 years ago, back when Tom still lived in the house where he'd grown up, back when his mother was alive, to buffer the silence between him and his father. He remembered that day clearly, one of the few bright memories that hadn't been tarnished by everything that came after. Margaret had called him over to Earl's place, excited about something she wouldn't explain over the phone. He'd found her in the backyard, kneeling beside a cardboard box filled with golden fluff and puppy squeaks. "Your father thought you needed some company," she'd said, her eyes bright with the kind of joy that made problems disappear. "This one kept climbing out to get to us. I think she chose you." Earl had been standing in the doorway of his workshop, trying to look stern but failing. To hide his smile, "Dog needs a good home," he'd said gruffly. "Figured you might need something to take care of besides yourself." That was Earl's way, Tom remembered now. Always indirect, always leaving room for rejection, as if genuine kindness was something to be embarrassed about. Tom had taken Honey home that day, and for years she'd been the bridge between the life he'd imagined and the life he was building. She'd been there through his marriage to Linda, patient and loyal when they'd fought, a constant presence that made their house feel like a home. But Linda had never really liked dogs. She'd tolerated Honey, fed her when necessary, even pet her occasionally when she thought Tom was watching. But after Margaret died 3 years ago, after the funeral that had ended with Tom storming out of his father's house, Linda had made her feelings clear. "She's getting old, Tom," Linda had said one evening, watching Honey struggle to climb onto the couch. Maybe it's time to think about what's best for everyone. Tom had known what she meant, but he'd chosen to ignore it. Honey had been his mother's gift, the last connection to a time when his family felt whole. He couldn't abandon her, not then. But Linda's patience had worn thin as the vet bills mounted and Honey's needs grew more demanding. The divorce had been inevitable, Tom supposed. Two people who'd built their relationship on the idea of who they might become, only to discover they'd been moving in opposite directions all along. Linda wanted adventure, travel, freedom from responsibility. Tom wanted stability, predictability, something solid to stand on. Neither of them had gotten what they wanted. Now, in the cramped apartment that smelled like failure, Tom looked at Honey and saw only burden. She moved slowly, ate expensive prescription food, and required medications that cost more than his monthly groceries. Her breathing was labored, her once bright eyes clouded with age and discomfort. The vet had been honest about her prognosis. Expensive treatment might buy her a few more months, but they wouldn't be good months. Tom pulled out the latest bill. From his jacket pocket, the paper worn from being folded and unfolded too many times. $347 for last week's visit, when Dr. Martinez had adjusted her medications and recommended another round of tests. The credit card company had called twice this week, their voices polite but insistent about overdue payments. He looked around the apartment, taking inventory of his reduced circumstances. The second-hand furniture Linda had deemed unworthy of the house. The single window that looked out onto the parking lot of the Dairy Queen across the street. The refrigerator covered with overdue notices and expired coupons he'd never use. This wasn't the life he'd planned, and Honey wasn't the companion he could afford. The rational voice in his head had been growing louder each day. She was suffering, and he was prolonging that suffering for his own selfish reasons. The kind thing, the practical thing, would be to let her go peacefully. Dr. Martinez had mentioned it gently, the way veterinarians do when they know a pet owner is struggling. But Tom couldn't bring himself to make that appointment. Not yet. Some part of him still remembered the puppy who'd chosen him, the dog who'd slept by his bed during his mother's long illness, who'd been the only witness to his grief when Margaret died. Honey represented the last piece of his old life before the divorce, before the money problems, before he'd become the kind of man who lived alone and ate dinner from a microwave. Yet every morning brought fresh evidence of her decline, the way she struggled to get up from her bed, the medications lined up on his kitchen counter like a pharmacy, the specialized food that cost more per pound than the ground beef he couldn't afford for himself, the guilt that gnawed at him when he saw her looking at him with those trusting brown eyes, as if she still believed he could fix everything. Tom had always prided himself on being practical, on making hard decisions when they needed to be made. But this decision felt different, weighted with more than just financial considerations. It felt like the final acknowledgement that the man he'd once been, the man his mother had raised him to be, was gone forever. He walked to the kitchen and opened the cabinet where he kept Honey's medications. Bottles of pills with names he couldn't pronounce, each one a small fortune, each one a reminder of his inadequacy. The bottle of heart medication was nearly empty, and the refill would cost another $120 he didn't have outside. The sun was setting over Cedar Falls, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded him of better times. Honey had found her way to her bed by the window, where she liked to watch the world go by. Her breathing was steady but labored, and Tom wondered if she knew what he was thinking, if dogs could sense when their owners had reached the end of their rope. Tomorrow, he decided, tomorrow he would call Dr. Martinez and have the conversation he'd been avoiding. It would be quick and painless, the vet had assured him. She would just go to sleep, surrounded by people who cared about her. It was the merciful thing to do, the responsible thing. But even as Tom made this resolution, he found himself avoiding Honey's gaze, afraid of what he might see there. Trust, maybe. Love, certainly. the kind of unconditional devotion that made betrayal possible. He turned away from the window and began preparing his dinner, telling himself he was making the right choice for both of them, the rational choice. The only choice that made sense in a life that had been stripped down to its essential failures. He just wished it felt less like surrender. The morning came too soon, arriving with the kind of gray light that made everything look tired. Tom had barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling while Honey wheezed softly from her bed beside him. He'd made his decision in the cruel hours before dawn, when the weight of his circumstances felt heaviest and the path forward seemed clear. But clarity, he discovered, was different from courage. He called in sick to work, his voice steady as he lied to his supervisor about stomach flu. The deception came easily now, another small betrayal in a life that seemed built on them. Honey watched him from her bed, her tail offering a tentative wag when their eyes met. She still trusted him, still believed that whatever came next would be in her best interest. Tom dressed slowly, putting on his oldest jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. He avoided looking at Honey directly, afraid that meeting her gaze would break his resolve. Instead, he focused on the practical details, the logistics of what needed to be done. He couldn't afford the euthanasia appointment, not with Dr. Martinez's fees and the ceremonial touches that made pet owners feel better about their decisions. But there were other options, quieter options, that wouldn't leave him explaining himself to well-meaning veterinarians or dealing with the judgment in their eyes. Tom had driven the back roads around Cedar Falls his entire life, had hunted these hills as a boy with his father before everything went wrong between them. He knew places where a person could disappear for a while, where the land stretched empty and indifferent under the wide Iowa sky. Places where an old, sick dog might simply wander off and find peace in her own way. The thought made his stomach turn, but he pushed the feeling down. This wasn't cruelty, he told himself. This was mercy, disguised as necessity. Honey would find her way to a quiet spot and lie down, and it would be over without the clinical coldness of a vet's office or the crushing weight of another bill he couldn't pay. "Come on, girl," he said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. "Let's go for a ride." Honey struggled to her feet, her movements stiff but determined. She'd always loved car rides, back when his truck meant adventures instead of endings. Tom helped her into the cab, lifting her more gently than he had in months, and she settled beside him with a contented sigh. He drove west out of town, past the familiar landmarks of his childhood, and into the rolling farmland that stretched toward the horizon. The radio played softly, some country song about second chances that made him reach over and turn it off. Honey watched the passing scenery with interest, her nose pressed against the window glass, like she was memorizing the world. Tom found the place. He'd been looking for about 20 miles from town, a gravel pull-off beside a fence line where the road curved around a stand of oak trees. He'd stopped here before, years ago, when he needed time to think or space to breathe. It was quiet, isolated, the kind of place where no one would bother an old dog trying to find her way home to something better than what she was leaving behind. He parked the truck and sat for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Honey had turned to look at him, her expression patient and trusting, waiting for whatever came next. In her eyes, he saw the puppy she'd been, the companion she'd become, the burden she'd grown into. And in that moment, something inside him cracked. Tom reached over and unclipped Honey's collar, the worn leather strap that held her tags and identification. The brass nameplate caught the morning light, engraved with words that belonged to a different life. Honey, if found, call Margaret Mitchell, followed by his mother's old phone number, disconnected now for 3 years. Margaret had insisted on that collar, had driven to the pet store in Des Moines to have it specially made because she wanted Honey to have something beautiful, something that would identify her as beloved. Tom stared at the nameplate now, remembering his mother's excitement when she'd presented it, the way she'd fussed over getting the buckle just right. He slipped the collar into his jacket pocket, telling himself it was practical. If someone found Honey, they couldn't trace her back to him. They couldn't call and ask questions he wasn't prepared to answer. Couldn't make him explain why he'd made the choices that led to this moment. "Come on," he said, opening the truck door. "Let's stretch our legs." Honey jumped down carefully, her movements slow but determined. She sniffed around the gravel shoulder, investigating the scents of other travelers who'd stopped here before them. A semi-truck rumbled past, heading west toward bigger towns and different problems, and Honey watched it with mild interest before returning to her exploration. Tom walked with her to the fence line, where wildflowers grew in untended profusion, and the land rolled away toward a distant farmhouse. It was peaceful here, he told himself. Quiet and safe, with plenty of water from the creek that ran alongside the road. If Honey was going to find her own way to whatever came next, this was as good a place as any. But as they stood together in the morning light, Tom felt the weight of what he was about to do settle around him like a physical thing. This dog had slept beside his bed for 12 years. She'd comforted him through his mother's death, had been patient with his anger, and present for his grief. She'd asked for nothing more than food, shelter, and the kind of basic affection that any decent person would provide. And he was about to abandon her on a country road because her medical bills were inconvenient. The realization hit him like cold water, sudden and clarifying. This wasn't mercy. This wasn't even practical necessity. This was cowardice dressed up as kindness, cruelty disguised as compassion. He was abandoning a creature who'd never abandoned him, and no amount of rationalization could change that fundamental truth. But even as the knowledge burned in his chest, Tom found himself walking back toward the truck. Honey followed, assuming. They were continuing their adventure together, trusting that whatever happened next would happen with her person beside her. She jumped up against the tailgate, expecting to be lifted back into the cab for the drive home. Instead, Tom opened the driver's door and climbed in alone. Honey's confusion was immediate and heartbreaking. She barked once, sharp and questioning, then ran around to his window and jumped up against the glass. Her paws scrabbled for purchase as she tried to understand why the door wasn't opening, why her person was sitting inside without her. Tom forced himself to look straight ahead, to focus on the road instead of the dog, who was frantically trying to reach him. He turned the key in the ignition, and the engine's rumble seemed to panic Honey further. She ran from window to window, barking now with real distress, her voice carrying across the empty fields like an accusation. "I'm sorry," Tom whispered, though he knew she couldn't hear him through the glass. "I'm sorry, but I can't." He put the truck in drive and pulled back onto the road, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. In the rearview mirror, he could see Honey running after him, her golden form growing smaller as he accelerated. She ran until she couldn't run anymore, until the distance between them grew too great for hope to bridge. Tom drove for 5 miles before he had to pull over again, this time to be sick beside the road. When he was done retching, he sat in the truck and tried to convince himself he'd done the right thing. Honey would find help, or she wouldn't. Either way, she was no longer his responsibility, no longer a drain on resources he didn't have. But as he drove back toward town, toward his empty apartment and his reduced life, Tom couldn't shake the image of Honey's eyes in those final moments. The confusion there, the betrayal, the slow understanding that the person she trusted most in the world was driving away without her. He'd told himself he was setting her free, but freedom and abandonment were different things entirely. And somewhere on that empty stretch of highway, an old dog was learning the difference the hard way. Earl Mitchell had been driving the same route every morning for 3 years, ever since Margaret passed and left him with too much time and too many memories. The circuit took him along County Road 47, past the Henshaw Farm and the old Sinclair station, through the kind of countryside that looked the same as it had 40 years ago. It wasn't that he had anywhere particular to go, more that sitting still in the house they'd shared for 53 years felt like drowning in slow motion at 82. Earl moved with the careful deliberation of a man who'd learned to respect his limitations. His arthritis spoke up on cold mornings, and his right knee complained about stairs. But his mind remained sharp and his hands steady. He'd spent 40 years fixing things that other people had given up on, first in the army and then in his shop behind the house. And retirement hadn't dulled his instinct to notice when something was out of place, which was why he spotted the dog immediately. She was sitting in the gravel beside the road, about 20 yards from where the oak trees cast their shade across the asphalt. A golden retriever, older by the look of her, with the kind of patient posture that suggested she'd been waiting for something that wasn't coming. Earl slowed his pickup truck, pulled onto the shoulder, and cut the engine. "Well now," he said to himself, studying the dog through his windshield. "What are you doing out here, girl?" The dog looked up at the sound of his voice, her tail offering a tentative wag. She was thin, Earl noticed, thinner than a well-cared-for retriever should be, and her coat had the dull quality that spoke of poor nutrition or illness. But her eyes were bright and intelligent, and when Earl opened his truck door, she approached with the cautious friendliness of a dog who'd been taught to trust people. "Easy there," Earl said, extending his hand for her to sniff. "Let me take a look at you." The dog submitted to his examination with the patience of long experience. Earl ran his hands along her sides, feeling for injuries or obvious problems. She was dehydrated, he could tell that much, and underweight. Her breathing seemed labored, and when he looked into her mouth, her gums were paler than they should be. But what caught his attention most was the indentation around her neck where a collar had been, the flattened fur that suggested something had been removed recently. "Someone left you here, didn't they?" Earl said softly, his voice carrying the kind of gentle authority that had calmed nervous animals for decades. "Question is, was it accident or purpose?" The dog leaned against his legs, seeking comfort or simply contact with another living thing. Earl felt something stir in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than sympathy. There was something familiar about this dog, something that nagged at the edges of his memory, like a half-remembered song. He walked back to his truck and retrieved a bottle of water from behind the seat, pouring some into his cup palm for the dog to drink. She lapped at it gratefully, then looked up at him with an expression that was somehow both hopeful and resigned. She'd been abandoned before, Earl realized. This wasn't the panic of a lost pet, but the weary acceptance of a creature who'd learned that the people she trusted most were capable of walking away. "Come on then," Earl said, opening the passenger door of his truck. "Can't leave you out here in this heat." The dog jumped up into the cab with some effort, settling on the bench seat with a sigh of relief. Earl climbed back behind the wheel and sat for a moment, studying his unexpected passenger. She was watching him with those intelligent brown eyes, and something about her expression triggered a memory so sharp it made him catch his breath. Christmas morning, 15 years ago. Margaret standing in their kitchen, her face bright with excitement as she watched their son, Tom, unwrap the small package she'd prepared with such care. Inside had been a collar, made of soft leather with a brass nameplate that read "Honey" in Margaret's careful script. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" Margaret had said, watching the golden retriever puppy explore their backyard with boundless energy. I think she chose Tom, the way she kept climbing out of the box to get to him. Earl had stood in the doorway of his workshop, trying to look stern about the addition to their household, but unable to hide his pleasure at seeing Tom's face light up with genuine joy. It had been the first time in months that his son had seemed truly happy, and Margaret had been so proud of herself for thinking of it. "Dog needs a good home," Earl had said gruffly, the way he said most things that mattered too much to say directly. "Figured you might need something to take care of besides yourself." Now, looking at the dog beside him in his truck, Earl felt the weight of recognition settle over him like a familiar coat. The shape of her head, the intelligent eyes, the way she held herself with dignity despite her circumstances. This was Honey, grown old and abandoned, but unmistakably the same dog who'd brought such joy to his family all those years ago. "Honey," he said softly, and the dog's ears perked up at the sound of her name. Her tail began to wag, and she leaned forward to lick his hand with desperate gratitude. Earl felt something cold settle in his stomach as the implications became clear. If Honey was here, abandoned on a country road 20 miles from town, then Tom had put her here. His own son had driven out to this lonely stretch of highway and left his mother's gift to die alone in the summer heat. The knowledge hit him harder than he'd expected, a blow that seemed to echo through all the years of silence that had grown between them. After Margaret's funeral, when Tom had stormed out of the house in anger and accusation, Earl had told himself that time would heal the wounds between them, that eventually his son would come around, would remember that family was supposed to matter more than pride or old resentments. But this abandoning an animal that had been loved by Margaret, leaving her to suffer because caring for her had become inconvenient, this was something Earl hadn't imagined his son capable of. It spoke to a hardness that went deeper than grief or financial pressure, a willingness to discard loyalty when it became burdensome. Earl reached into the glove compartment and pulled out Margaret's old gardening gloves, the ones she'd always kept in his truck for when they'd stop to pick wildflowers along their drives. He held them for a moment, remembering her hands in them, the way she'd fuss over the flower beds behind the house even when the arthritis made it difficult. Margaret had loved this dog, had taken such pride in choosing her for Tom. She'd believed that Honey would be a bridge between father and son, a shared responsibility that might bring them closer together. Instead, the dog had become another casualty of the distance that had grown between them, abandoned when love became too expensive to maintain. "Well, Honey," Earl said, stroking the dog's head with gentle fingers, "looks like it's just you and me now. Let's get you to the vet and see what we can do about getting you well again." As he started the truck and pulled back onto the road, Earl felt something he hadn't experienced in years: purpose. Margaret was gone, and Tom had made his choices, but this dog still needed someone to care about her welfare. Someone who remembered what it meant to keep faith with creatures who couldn't keep it for themselves. The drive to town would give him time to plan, to figure out how to help Honey without making things worse for everyone involved. But first, he needed to get her medical attention and make sure she survived whatever neglect had brought her to this point. Some responsibilities, Earl reflected, didn't end just because they became difficult to bear. Dr. Sarah Chung looked up from her examination table as Earl Mitchell carried the golden retriever through the front door of Cedar Falls Veterinary Clinic. In her 8 years of practice, she'd learned to read the stories that walked through her door. The guilty pet owners with animals who'd gotten into something they shouldn't have. The anxious families with elderly pets facing their final days. The hopeful faces bringing home new puppies. But Earl's expression was different, a mixture of determination and grief that spoke to something more complicated than a simple medical emergency. "Found her on County Road 47, Earl said without preamble, settling the dog gently on the examination table. "Been out there a while by the look of her." Sarah began her examination with practiced efficiency, her hands gentle as she assessed the dog's condition. Dehydration was the immediate concern, along with what appeared to be untreated heart disease based on the dog's labored breathing and pale gums. The animal was underweight, her coat dull and brittle, suggesting months of inadequate nutrition or medical neglect. "She's not feral," Sarah observed, noting how calmly the dog accepted handling. "This is someone's pet, or was. Well-trained, used to human contact. See how she responds to voice commands?" Earl nodded, his weathered hands stroking the dog's head with surprising gentleness. "Goes by Honey. Knows her name, anyway. Any idea? How long she's been out there? Hard to say. Day or two, maybe. Long enough to get into trouble. Sarah continued her examination, making notes on a chart she'd labeled Honey, Stray. The dog's heart murmur was pronounced, indicating advanced cardiac disease that would require ongoing medication and monitoring. Her blood work would tell the full story, but Sarah had seen enough cases like this to recognize the signs of expensive, chronic illness. She's going to need some work, Sarah said carefully. Our medication probably for the rest of her life. Special diet, regular monitoring. We're looking at several $100s just to get her stabilized. And that's before we talk about long-term care. Earl was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing patterns in the dog's fur. At 82, he lived on a fixed income that didn't leave much room for unexpected expenses. But something about this particular dog seemed to have touched him in a way that transcended practical considerations. What would you do if she was yours? He asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. She'd learned that people asking that question were usually looking for permission to make a difficult choice, whether toward treatment or letting go. But Earl's tone suggested he was genuinely seeking guidance, not justification for a decision already made. Honestly, with the right care, she could have good quality of life for another year, maybe two. The heart disease is manageable if caught early enough, and she's got good spirits despite everything she's been through. But it won't be cheap, and it won't be easy. Earl nodded slowly. Margaret always said animals don't have anybody else to speak for them. Figured that made it our responsibility to do right by them when we can. Margaret was your wife? 53 years. Lost her 3 years back. Earl's voice carried the kind of matter-of-fact sadness that comes from long practice in accepting loss. She had a way with animals, always bringing home strays and injured birds. Drove me half crazy sometimes, but she'd say they didn't choose to need help, so we didn't get to choose whether to give it. Sarah found herself smiling despite the seriousness of the situation. She sounds like someone I would have liked. Would have loved you. Always said the world needed more people willing to fix things instead of throwing them away. Something in Earl's tone suggested this was about more than veterinary philosophy, but Sarah had learned not to pry into the personal stories that accompanied her patients. Instead, she focused on the immediate medical needs and began preparing for the treatment Honey would require. I'll need to keep her overnight for observation and to get her started on 4 fluids, Sarah said. Blood work will tell us more about what we're dealing with, but I think you're making the right choice. She's got fight left in her. As if responding to the compliment, Honey lifted her head and offered a tentative tail wag. The simple gesture seemed to strengthen Earl's resolve, and he reached into his wallet to provide the deposit for her care. Over the next several days, Earl became a fixture at the veterinary clinic. He arrived each morning at precisely 8 o'clock, bringing with him a thermos of coffee and a newspaper he rarely opened. Instead, he spent his time sitting beside Honey's kennel, talking to her in the kind of low, steady voice that seemed to calm her anxiety and speed her recovery. Sarah found herself looking forward to his visits, partly because of his gentle way with the animals, but mostly because of the stories he told while Honey rested. He spoke about Margaret's garden, about the birds she'd nursed back to health in their kitchen, about the way she'd always seen potential for healing in creatures other people had written off. She gave this dog to our son, Earl said one morning, his voice carefully neutral. Christmas present, years back. Thought it might give him something to care about besides his own troubles. Sarah waited for more details, but Earl seemed disinclined to elaborate. The silence stretched between them, comfortable but weighted with unspoken complications. Sometimes people make choices they can't take back, Earl said finally. Margaret used to say the best thing about animals is they don't hold grudges. Give them a reason to trust again, and they will. And people? Earl considered this, his hand resting on Honey's head as she dozed in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the clinic window. People are harder. We remember every hurt, carry it around like evidence of how the world works. But maybe that's why we need animals around too. Remind us what forgiveness looks like. By the end of the week, Honey had stabilized enough to go home with Earl. Her heart medication would need daily monitoring, and her diet required careful management, but her spirits had improved dramatically. She followed Earl around the clinic with something approaching devotion, as if recognizing him as the person who'd chosen to invest in her future when someone else had decided. She didn't have one dot as Earl filled out the final paperwork. Sarah noticed the address he provided, the same street where the Mitchell family had lived for decades, according to longtime residents who'd mentioned them in passing. She wondered about the son he'd mentioned, about the circumstances that had led to Honey's abandonment, but Earl's quiet dignity discouraged direct questions. "She's lucky you found her," Sarah said as Earl prepared to leave. Earl looked down at Honey, who was pressed against his legs with the contentment of a creature who'd found her place in the world again. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe I'm the lucky one. Sometimes we don't know we need saving until someone gives us something worth saving." He walked out of the clinic with Honey beside him, both of them moving slowly but with purpose toward whatever came next. The story might have remained a quiet act of kindness between an old man and a rescued dog if not for Janet Kowalski's curious nature and her position as editor of the Cedar Falls Gazette. Janet had been covering local news for 37 years, long enough to recognize when a simple human interstory contained layers worth exploring. She'd first heard about Earl and Honey from Dr. Sarah Chung, who'd mentioned the case during their monthly coffee at Murphy's Diner. Sarah had a policy of not discussing her patients, but something about Earl's dedication to the abandoned dog had impressed her enough to share the basic details: an elderly widower rescuing a dog someone had left to die, spending his modest retirement savings on expensive medical care for an animal he'd found by chance. "There's something special about this man," Sarah had said, stirring sugar into her coffee with the careful attention of someone choosing her words precisely. "The way he talks to that dog, the patience he shows during her recovery. It's like he's trying to heal something in himself through helping her." Janet had initially planned a simple feel-good piece for the Gazette's community section, the kind of story that reminded readers that kindness still existed in a world that often seemed determined to prove otherwise. But when she arrived at Earl's house for the interview, she quickly realized she'd stumbled onto something more complex. Earl lived in the same house he'd shared with Margaret for over 5 decades, a modest 2-story on Maple Street with a workshop behind it and a garden that showed signs of careful tending despite his age. Honey greeted Janet at the door with the measured friendliness of a dog who'd learned to be cautious with strangers, but still believed in the possibility of good intentions. "She's doing well," Earl said, settling into his favorite chair while Honey arranged herself at his feet. "Heart medication twice a day, special food, but she's got her appetite back and she's sleeping better." Janet asked the usual questions about the rescue, Earl's decision to take on such an expensive commitment, his plans for Honey's ongoing care. Earl answered thoughtfully, his responses revealing a man who considered the practical implications, but had been guided ultimately by something beyond financial calculation. "My wife always said animals don't get to choose their circumstances," Earl explained, his hand automatically moving to stroke Honey's head. "They depend on people to do right by them. Sometimes that costs more than we planned, but planning isn't really the point." It was when Janet asked about Honey's background, about any attempts to locate her original owner, that Earl's demeanor shifted slightly. The question seemed to pain him in a way that suggested personal knowledge, and his answer was carefully neutral. "Sometimes people make choices they think are necessary," he said, his eyes focused on something beyond Janet's shoulder. doesn't mean those choices are right, but circumstances can push folks into corners they never expected to find themselves in. Janet had been interviewing people long enough to recognize evasion, but Earl's obvious discomfort with the topic made her reluctant to press for details. Instead, she focused on the positive aspects of the story: Earl's generosity, Honey's recovery, the bond that had formed between them. The article ran on page 3 of the following Thursday's Gazette under the headline, "Local Man Rescues Abandoned Dog, Proves Kindness Still Matters." Janet had written it as a simple human interest piece, emphasizing Earl's compassion and Honey's resilience without dwelling on the circumstances that had brought them together. But the story's impact exceeded her expectations. Within hours of the paper's publication, the Gazette's phone began ringing with readers wanting more information. Some called to praise Earl's actions, others to inquire about making donations toward Honey's medical care. Several people asked if there were other animals in need, if Earl was running some kind of informal rescue operation. By Friday, the story had been shared on the Cedar Falls community Facebook page, where it generated dozens of comments and reactions. Local residents tagged friends and family members, sharing their own stories of rescued animals and acts of kindness. The post gained traction beyond Cedar Falls as people shared it with their own networks, touched by the image of an elderly man dedicating his resources to saving a dog someone else had discarded. Heartwarming story about Earl Mitchell and his rescue dog Honey, read one of the most shared posts. This is what compassion looks like, stepping up when someone else has given up. Cedar Falls is lucky to have people like Earl. The comments section filled with praise for Earl's actions, but also with questions about Honey's original owner. Several people expressed anger at whoever had abandoned her, with some calling for the person to be identified and held accountable. The conversation took on an increasingly judgmental tone as more people weighed in with their opinions about animal abandonment and the responsibilities of pet ownership. "Whoever dumped this poor dog should be ashamed," wrote one commenter. "How? Do you look at an animal who's loved you for years and just drive away? Some people don't deserve the loyalty dogs give them. I hope they're reading this and feeling every bit as worthless as their actions," added another. Earl Mitchell is a saint for cleaning up someone else's cruelty. Janet watched the online response with mixed feelings. She'd intended to celebrate Earl's kindness, not create a platform for condemning the unknown person who'd abandoned Honey. But the story had taken on a life of its own, generating the kind of emotional response that made people want to take sides and assign blame. The attention began to affect Earl as well. Neighbors stopped by his house to meet Honey and express their admiration for his actions. The local veterinary supply store offered to donate dog food and medication. A reporter from the Des Moines Register called to ask about doing a follow-up piece for a wider audience. Earl handled the attention with characteristic grace, accepting praise modestly and deflecting credit whenever possible. But Janet noticed that he seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the focus on Honey's abandonment, changing the subject whenever people speculated about her original owner or expressed outrage at her treatment. People want someone to blame, Earl told Janet when she called to check on how he was handling the response. Makes them feel better about their own choices, I suppose. But blame doesn't heal anything. Doesn't help Honey, doesn't change what happened. Do you think the person who left her might come forward? Janet asked, partly from professional curiosity and partly from genuine concern about the story's implications. Earl was quiet for a long moment, and Janet wondered if she'd overstepped some boundary she hadn't recognized. Sometimes the hardest thing about forgiveness, Earl said finally, is that it has to happen before the other person deserves it. Honey's moved on from whatever hurt her. Maybe the rest of us should do the same. But even as Earl counseled compassion, the story continued to spread across social media platforms, reaching audiences far beyond Cedar Falls. Each share brought new comments, New expressions of outrage at the unknown person who'd abandoned Honey. New praise for Earl's intervention. What had begun as local news was becoming something larger, a symbol of the kind of moral clarity people craved in an increasingly complicated world. Earl Mitchell represented decency and compassion. Honey's unnamed former owner represented everything that was wrong with people who prioritize convenience over loyalty. The story had found its heroes and villains, even if one of them remained invisible. And somewhere in Cedar Falls, someone was watching the praise and condemnation accumulate, knowing that the villain everyone was condemning had a name, an address, and a growing sense that his private shame was about to become very public indeed. Tom Mitchell first saw the screenshot on his phone during lunch break at Brennan Auto Parts, when his coworker Danny Martinez thrust the device toward him with the kind of excited energy reserved for gossip that felt both shocking and satisfying. "You gotta see this, man," Danny said, his voice carrying across the small break room where Tom was eating a sandwich that tasted like cardboard and guilt. "This old guy in town, Earl Mitchell, you know him? He rescued this dog that's some piece of garbage dumped on the highway. Look at all these comments." Tom's hand froze halfway to his mouth, the sandwich suddenly impossible to swallow. He stared at the screen Danny was holding, watching the likes and shares accumulate on a post that had already been shared over 300 times. The photo showed his father older than Tom remembered, more fragile-looking, sitting beside a golden retriever that was unmistakably Honey. "Earl Mitchell's my," Tom started, then stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. Father felt too intimate for their current relationship. Family seemed like a lie given their 15 years of silence. "You know him?" Danny asked, oblivious to Tom's distress. "Dude's like a local hero now. Look at these comments. Everyone's calling him a saint. But they are not holding back on whoever abandoned that dog. People are pissed." Tom scrolled through the comments with growing horror, each one feeling like a personal indictment. The language was harsh, unforgiving, filled with the kind of moral certainty that people felt when condemning strangers for actions they'd never had to contemplate themselves. "Hope they find whoever did this and make them pay. Some people don't deserve to breathe the same air as decent folks like Earl Mitchell. That poor dog's eyes, you can see she's been through hell. Whoever abandoned her is pure evil. I hope karma finds this person and makes them suffer the way they made that innocent animal suffer." Tom handed the phone back to Danny, his appetite completely gone. Around the break room, other workers were pulling up the story on their own devices, adding their own commentary to the growing chorus of outrage. The conversation buzzed with speculation about the kind of person who could abandon a dog, theories about what should happen to them if they were ever identified. "My money's on some rich asshole who didn't want to pay vet bills," said Jake Peterson, the shop's youngest mechanic. "Probably figured nobody would find her out there, so they wouldn't have to deal with the guilt. Or some deadbeat who moved and didn't want the hassle of taking a dog along," added Maria Santos, who managed the parts counter. "People like that shouldn't be allowed to have pets in the first place." Tom excused himself and walked to the parking lot, where he sat in his truck and tried to process what was happening. The story of Earl rescuing Honey had somehow become viral, spreading far beyond Cedar Falls to capture the attention of people who had no connection to their family but felt qualified to pass judgment on the situation. He pulled up the original newspaper article on his phone, reading Janet Kowalski's measured account of the rescue. The piece was respectful, focusing on Earl's kindness rather than condemning the unknown person who'd abandoned Honey. But the social media response had taken on a life of its own, transforming what might have been a simple good news story into a morality play with clear heroes and villains. Over the following days, Tom watched the story continue to spread across multiple platforms. Local Facebook groups shared it with increasingly inflammatory commentary. Twitter users retweeted it, with their own angry observations about animal cruelty and moral failures. Instagram accounts dedicated to animal rescue reposted the photos with captions that called for justice against whoever had thrown away such a loving dog. The most viral post came from an account called Rescue Warriors with over 50,000 followers. Meet Honey. This beautiful girl was abandoned on a highway to die alone, but was saved by an angel named Earl Mitchell 82, who's spending his retirement money to give her the medical care her previous owner couldn't be bothered to provide. While Earl shows us what compassion looks like, the coward who dumped Honey shows us the worst of humanity. Share to spread Earl's story and remind the world that heroes come in all ages. Hashtag Rescue Warriors, hashtag Honey deserves better, hashtag Earl Mitchell is a hero. The post generated over 10,000 shares in its first day, with comments that grew increasingly creative in their condemnation of Honey's former owner. People suggested everything, from public shaming to criminal charges to vigilante justice. The story had tapped into something deeper than animal welfare, a desire to identify clear moral boundaries in a world that often felt morally ambiguous. Tom found himself checking the social media response obsessively, each new share feeling like another person joining a jury that had already decided his guilt. He began avoiding his usual places around town, afraid of running into people who might recognize him or ask questions about his connection to Earl Mitchell. The name felt dangerous now, carrying implications that could expose the secret he'd been carrying since that morning on County Road 47 at work. Conversations about the story continued for days. His coworkers shared updates about Earl's media appearances, donations that had poured in for Honey's care, and ongoing speculation about the identity of the person who'd abandoned her. Tom participated in these discussions with the careful neutrality of someone trying not to reveal too much knowledge, but each conversation felt like walking through a minefield. "I heard they're trying to track down the original owner through veterinary records," Maria mentioned one afternoon. "If that dog was getting medical care somewhere, there's got to be a paper trail." Tom's blood ran cold. Dr. Martinez had been treating Honey for months, had detailed records of her condition and treatment history. If anyone connected those records to the dog Earl had rescued, the timeline would become clear. The gap between Honey's last veterinary visit and her appearance on the highway would point directly to Tom's decision to abandon her. That evening, Tom sat in his apartment staring at his phone, scrolling through the endless stream of comments and shares. The story had been picked up by regional news outlets, animal rescue organizations, and feel-good news aggregators. Each new platform brought fresh waves of outrage directed at the faceless person who'd betrayed Honey's trust. But what disturbed Tom most wasn't the anger of strangers. It was seeing his father's face in photo after photo, looking happier and more purposeful than Tom remembered from their years of estrangement. Earl had found something worth caring about in Honey's rescue, a project that seemed to have energized him in ways that retirement and widowhood hadn't, and Tom had made that possible through the worst decision of his life. The irony was crushing. His act of abandonment had inadvertently given his father a sense of purpose, had brought Earl the kind of positive attention and community support that might have healed some of the loneliness Margaret's death had left behind. The whole town was celebrating Earl's compassion, holding him up as an example of human decency, while somewhere, the son Earl didn't know he was defending sat alone in a cramped apartment, watching the praise accumulate for cleaning up a mess Tom had created through his own moral failure. The story had gone viral, and Tom Mitchell was the invisible villain at its center, trapped between the growing weight of public condemnation and the impossibility of coming forward without destroying the one good thing his cruelty had accidentally produced. The confrontation Tom had been dreading came on a Tuesday morning in October, when the weight of watching his father become a local celebrity for cleaning up his mess finally became unbearable. He'd spent 3 weeks monitoring the social media storm, watching Earl give interviews to local television stations and accept donations from animal lovers across the state, all while the invisible specter of Tom's guilt grew heavier with each passing day. The breaking point came when Tom saw a new post from the Cedar Falls community page announcing that Earl Mitchell would be honored at the monthly city council meeting for his base outstanding example of community compassion. The accompanying photo showed Earl sitting in Dr. Chun's waiting room with Honey, both of them looking content and purposeful in a way that made Tom's stomach turn with a mixture of grief and self-loathing. He called in sick to work and drove across town to the veterinary clinic, his hands shaking on the steering wheel as he rehearsed conversations he'd been avoiding for years. The parking lot was empty except for Earl's familiar pickup truck, which somehow made the confrontation feel more inevitable and more terrifying. Tom sat in his car for 10 minutes, watching through the clinic's front windows as Earl moved slowly around the waiting area with Honey at his side. Even from a distance, he could see that his father looked older, more fragile than the man who'd raised him. Earl's movements were careful, deliberate, the kind of caution that came with age and awareness of mortality. But there was something else in Earl's posture, something Tom hadn't seen in the years before their estrangement: contentment. His father looked like a man who'd found purpose again, who had something important to care about. The knowledge that Tom's worst decision had somehow given Earl this sense of meaning made the approaching confrontation feel even more loaded with potential destruction. Tom finally forced himself out of the car and through the clinic's front door, where the receptionist looked up with professional friendliness that faltered when she saw his expression. "I need to speak with Earl Mitchell," Tom said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. Earl turned at the sound, and Tom watched recognition dawn slowly across his father's weathered features. 15 years of silence compressed into a single moment of mutual assessment, each man taking inventory of how the other had changed during their long estrangement. "Tom," Earl said simply, his voice carrying no particular emotion beyond acknowledgement, "we need to talk. Outside." Earl nodded to Dr. Chun, who had emerged from an examination room and was watching the interaction with professional curiosity. "We'll be back in a few minutes," he told her, then followed Tom through the front door with Honey padding beside him. They stood in the parking lot like two fighters measuring each other before a bout, the afternoon sun casting long shadows that seemed to emphasize the distance between them. Tom had imagined this conversation dozens of times, had rehearsed accusations and justifications and pleas for understanding. But now, faced with his father's patient silence and Honey's trusting presence, all his prepared words felt inadequate. "That's my dog," Tom said finally, the admission coming out like a confession. Earl studied his son's face for a long moment, and Tom realized that his father had already known, had probably recognized Honey immediately despite the passage of years and the changes brought by age and illness. "I figured as much," Earl said quietly. "Question is, what are you planning to do about it?" The response caught Tom off guard. He'd expected anger, disappointment, maybe even relief that the mystery had been solved. But Earl's calm acceptance felt worse than any of those reactions would have been. "I couldn't afford her medical care," Tom said, the words spilling out in a rush of justification. "Do you have any idea what heart medication costs for a dog? $300 a month, plus the special food, plus the regular checkups. I'm living in a one-bedroom apartment, working at an auto parts store, trying to pay off credit cards from the divorce. I couldn't, so you drove her out to County Road 47 and left her to die." The stark summary of his actions, delivered in Earl's matter-of-fact tone, hit Tom harder than any accusation could have. There was no room for euphemism or rationalization in his father's words, just the brutal truth of what he'd done. "I thought someone would find her," Tom said weakly. "Someone who could afford to take care of her properly. Or she'd wander into the creek and drown, or get hit by a truck, or just lie down in the heat and die of dehydration. Earl's voice remained steady, but Tom could see something building behind his eyes. That what you thought would happen? I don't know what I thought. I was desperate, okay? Everything fell apart after Linda left, after I lost the house. The vet bills kept coming, and I couldn't pay them, and Honey was suffering. And I thought, you thought it was easier to let her suffer alone than to ask for help. The accusation hung between them like a physical thing, and Tom felt 15 years of accumulated resentment surge to the surface. This was exactly why he'd avoided his father for so long. Exactly the kind of judgment that had driven him away. In the first place, ask for help from who? Tom shot back. You? When's the last time we had a conversation that didn't end with you telling me how I was screwing up my life? When did you ever make me feel like I could come to you with problems? Earl was quiet for a moment, his hand automatically moving to rest on Honey's head. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weariness that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than physical fatigue. Your mother always said I was better with broken machines than broken people. Machines tell you what's wrong with them, make noise when they need attention. People, especially people you love, they suffer quietly, and by the time you notice, sometimes it's too late to fix what's broken. Tom felt some of his anger deflate at the mention of his mother, but he couldn't let go of the grievances that had defined their relationship for so long. You think I don't know that? You think I don't remember what it was like growing up in this house with you locked away in your workshop and Mom trying to pretend everything was fine? You taught me to handle problems alone, Dad. Don't act surprised that I took the lesson to heart. Is that what you think happened? I know what happened. I lived it. Earl reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small that caught the light. A simple gold band that Tom recognized immediately. His mother's wedding ring, the one she'd worn for 53 years until cancer had made her fingers too thin to hold it. She made me promise to give this to you, Earl said, holding the ring between them like an offering. Said you'd need something to remember that love doesn't disappear just because people don't know how to show it properly. Tom stared at the ring, feeling something crack open in his chest. You've been carrying that for 3 years? Every day. Waiting for you to come back so I could keep my promise to her. The simple statement undid something in Tom's defenses, but he couldn't let himself soften completely. There was too much history between them, too many years of silence and misunderstanding. You could have called, could have reached out after the funeral instead of what? Instead of respecting your decision to walk away? You made it pretty clear that day that you blamed me for how she died, for not getting her to the doctor sooner. Maybe you were right. Maybe I was too stubborn, too proud to admit she needed help I couldn't provide. Tom remembered that day with painful clarity, the funeral service where he'd accused his father of neglecting Margaret's symptoms, of prioritizing his own discomfort with doctors over his wife's health. He'd said things that couldn't be taken back, had stormed out of the house convinced that Earl's stoicism had cost his mother precious time. But looking at his father now, seeing the wedding ring that Earl had carried for 3 years like a talisman of unfinished business, Tom began to understand that grief had made them both cruel in different ways. She didn't want us to be enemies, Earl said quietly. Last thing she said to me was that you and I were too much alike for our own good, too proud to admit when we needed each other. Said that was her fault for not teaching us better. They stood in silence for a moment, two men who'd spent years nursing old wounds while life continued to diminish around them. Honey sensed the emotional weight of the conversation and pressed closer to Earl, her presence a reminder of the immediate crisis that had brought them together. What happens now? Tom asked finally. Earl looked down at the dog, who'd accidentally become the bridge between them, then back at his son. That depends on what kind of man you want to be going forward. The kind who abandons what he's supposed to protect, or the kind who finds a way to do better when he gets a second chance. The challenge was clear, and Tom realized that everything that came next would depend on whether he could find the courage to choose differently than he had on that highway 3 weeks ago. The weeks following Tom's confrontation with Earl felt like living in a pressure cooker that threatened to explode at any moment. Tom had returned to work with Earl's challenge echoing in his mind, but the social media storm around Honey's rescue continued to intensify, making it increasingly difficult to maintain the fiction that he was just another concerned observer, watching a heartwarming story unfold. The breaking point came when a local television producer named Rick Stanton contacted Earl about featuring the rescue story on a segment called Iowa Heroes, a monthly spotlight on ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The segment would air statewide, potentially reaching hundreds of thousands of viewers, with Earl's story of compassion and community support. Tom learned about the television interview from his coworker Danny, who'd become obsessed with following Earl's growing celebrity status. Danny showed him the announcement on his phone during lunch break, his voice full of excitement about the recognition Earl was receiving. "Dude's gonna be famous," Danny said, scrolling through comments that praised Earl's selflessness. "Look at this, people are calling him a saint, talking about how rare it is to find someone willing to sacrifice for a creature that can't pay them back. Your town's got a real hero." Tom felt physically sick as he read through the comments, each one another weight added to the crushing guilt he carried. The story had taken on mythic proportions in the public imagination, with Earl representing everything noble about human nature, while the unnamed person who'd abandoned Honey became a symbol of moral bankruptcy. But what made it worse was watching Earl struggle with the attention. Despite his growing reputation as a local hero, Tom could see that his father was overwhelmed by the media interest and community praise. Earl had always been a private man, more comfortable fixing things in his workshop than being celebrated for acts of kindness he considered basic human decency. Dr. Sarah Chun had become an unofficial spokesman for Earl, helping to coordinate interviews and manage the donations that continued to pour in for Honey's care. She'd also become protective of Earl's privacy, screening requests and making sure he wasn't exploited by people who wanted to use his story for their own purposes. Tom found himself driving past his father's house in the evenings, watching from a distance as Earl worked in the small garden Margaret had planted years ago. Honey was always nearby, moving slowly but contentedly as she supervised Earl's efforts to maintain the flower beds his wife had loved. The sight of them together, the old man and the rescued dog finding purpose in each other's company, should have been heartwarming. Instead, it filled Tom with a complex mixture of guilt, regret, and something that might have been envy. His father had found meaning in caring for the dog Tom had discarded, had discovered a sense of purpose that seemed to have revitalized him. Despite his age, Earl looked healthier than he had in years, more engaged with the world around him. The community's recognition had given him a reason to get up each morning, a project worthy of his attention and care. Meanwhile, Tom felt increasingly isolated and bitter. His co-workers continued to discuss Earl's story with admiration, unaware that they were praising someone for cleaning up a mess created by the person sitting right beside them. Neighbors who'd never paid attention to Tom before now greeted him with excitement when they learned his last name was Mitchell, wanting to know if he was related to the local hero. Each conversation required careful navigation, each expression of interest a potential trap that might expose his connection to the story. Tom found himself avoiding social situations entirely, declining invitations to Friday night drinks and weekend gatherings where Earl's story inevitably became a topic of conversation. The strain began affecting his work performance. He made mistakes on orders, struggled to concentrate during customer interactions, and started calling in sick more frequently. His supervisor at Brennan Auto Parts, a decent man named Mike Rodriguez, eventually pulled him aside to ask if everything was okay. "At home, you seem distracted lately," Mike said, his tone more concerned than accusatory. If there's something going on, family problems, health issues, financial stress, we can work something out. You're a good employee, Tom, but you seem like you're carrying something heavy. Tom almost broke down and confessed everything in that moment. The weight of his secret had become nearly unbearable, made worse by watching his father receive praise for virtues Tom had abandoned in a moment of desperation. But the fear of consequences, losing his job, facing legal action, destroying Earl's newfound happiness, kept him silent. "Just going through a rough patch," Tom said finally. "I'll get it together." But getting it together proved impossible as Earl's media appearances continued to generate attention. The Iowa Heroes segment aired on a Thursday evening, featuring Earl sitting in his living room with Honey beside him, talking about responsibility and the importance of caring for creatures who couldn't care for themselves. Tom watched the segment, alone in his apartment, transfixed by his father's words and horrified by their implications. Earl spoke about Margaret's influence on his values, about the way she taught him to see potential for healing in broken things. He talked about Honey's recovery, about the satisfaction of seeing her trust return gradually as she realized she was safe. "Animals don't have complicated motives," Earl said during the interview, his weathered hands gentle as he stroked Honey's coat. "They don't hold grudges or nurse resentments. Give them a reason to hope again, and they will. Sometimes. I think we could learn something from that kind of forgiveness." The segment concluded with Rick Stenton asking Earl what message he hoped people would take from his story. Earl was quiet for a moment, looking down at Honey with an expression that seemed to carry years of accumulated wisdom. "I suppose I want people to remember that love isn't something you do when it's convenient," Earl said finally. "It's what you do when it costs you something, when it would be easier to walk away. That's when it means something, when you choose to stay, even when staying is hard." Tom turned off the television and sat in the darkness of his apartment, feeling as though his father had delivered a personal indictment without knowing it. Every word of Earl's philosophy condemned the choice Tom had made on County Road 47. The moment when he'd chosen convenience over commitment, financial relief over moral responsibility. But what made it worse was the growing realization that Earl was right. Not just about the moral dimensions of the choice, but about the practical ones as well. Tom had been so focused on Honey's expensive medical needs that he'd never considered alternatives, payment plans with the veterinarian, assistance programs for pet owners facing financial hardship, or simply asking for help from people who might have been willing to provide it. Earl had managed Honey's care on a retirement income that couldn't have been much larger than Tom's salary. The difference wasn't resources, it was priority. Earl had decided that Honey's welfare was worth whatever sacrifice it required, while Tom had decided that his financial comfort was more important than her life. The community donations had helped, certainly, but Earl had committed to Honey's care before knowing that support would materialize. He'd made the choice to act based on principle rather than calculation, trusting that somehow he'd find a way to provide what she needed. As autumn deepened into early winter, Tom found himself trapped in an increasingly unsustainable situation. The guilt was consuming him from the inside, affecting his sleep, his appetite, his ability to function normally. But the fear of exposure kept him paralyzed, unable to confess and unable to move forward. Earl's celebrity continued to grow as the story spread through regional media and animal rescue networks. Honey appeared to be thriving under his care, her health stable and her spirits obviously improved. Father and dog had developed the kind of routine that suggested mutual contentment: morning walks around the neighborhood, afternoon rest periods in the garden, evening sessions where Earl worked on small repair projects while Honey supervised from her favorite spot by his workbench. Tom watched this developing bond with a mixture of relief and anguish. He was genuinely glad that Honey was healthy and happy, that she'd found someone capable of providing the care he'd been unable or unwilling to give. But the knowledge that his father had succeeded where he'd failed, that Earl's character had been strong enough to handle the challenge Tom had fled from, was a constant reminder of his own moral inadequacy. The situation couldn't continue indefinitely. Tom's guilt was becoming visible to everyone around him, his distraction and depression too obvious to hide. Mike Rodriguez had started asking more direct questions about his well-being, and Tom's coworkers had noticed his withdrawal from their social interactions. More dangerously, people had begun to ask more specific questions about his relationship. To Earl Mitchell, the shared last name was uncommon enough in Cedar Falls to generate curiosity, and Tom's obvious knowledge of the family's history had started to raise eyebrows among people who knew both men. Something had to give, and Tom found himself facing the same kind of choice that had led to Honey's abandonment in the first place. He could continue living with the secret, allowing the guilt to slowly destroy him while Earl unknowingly received praise for cleaning up his mess. Or he could find the courage to do what he should have done months ago, take responsibility for his actions and face whatever consequences followed. The decision, when it finally came, would be forced by circumstances beyond his control. But in the long nights of that early winter, Tom began to understand that his father's challenge hadn't been rhetorical. Earl really was offering him a second chance, an opportunity to choose differently when confronted with difficulty. The question was whether Tom could find the strength to choose courage over comfort, responsibility over self-protection, truth over the safety of continued silence. The call came at 2:47 on a Wednesday morning in November, jarring Tom from the restless half-sleep that had become his normal state. He fumbled for his phone in the darkness, his heart already racing with the kind of premonition that comes when the phone rings at an hour reserved for emergencies and bad news. Tom Mitchell? The voice was professional, calm in the way that medical personnel are trained to be when delivering information that will change someone's world. Yes, this is Tom. This is Dr. Sarah Chun from Cedar Falls Veterinary Clinic. I'm calling because your father, Earl Mitchell, has been brought to Cedar Falls General Hospital. You're listed as his emergency contact. Tom was already reaching for his clothes before the words fully registered. What happened? Is he collapsed at the clinic this evening while visiting Honey. The paramedics think it might have been a heart episode, but he was conscious when they transported him. Dr. Williams in the emergency department asked me to call you. Tom's mind raced as he pulled on jeans and grabbed his keys. Earl had seemed frailer during their confrontation weeks ago, but Tom had attributed that to age and the stress of unwanted media attention. The possibility that his father's health was seriously declining hadn't occurred to him, and the realization hit him with unexpected force. I'll be right there, Tom said, already heading for the door. The drive to Cedar Falls General took 12 minutes that felt like hours. Tom's truck cutting through empty streets illuminated by streetlights that seemed inadequate against the November darkness. He'd made this same drive 3 years ago when Margaret was dying, had spent weeks in the hospital waiting room watching Earl maintain his stoic vigil beside her bed. Now Earl was the patient, and Tom was the one rushing through hospital corridors, with his stomach churning and his hands shaking from something that wasn't entirely caffeine withdrawal. He found Earl in the emergency department, looking smaller and more vulnerable than Tom had ever seen him, connected to monitors and four lines. His father appeared every one of his 82 years in a way that the family resemblance made impossible to ignore. This was Tom's future, assuming he lived long enough to reach Earl's age, assuming his own choices didn't destroy him first. The preliminary tests suggest a mild heart attack, Dr. Williams explained, her voice carrying the kind of measured optimism that doctors use when the news could be worse, but isn't exactly good. We're going to keep him overnight for observation and run some additional tests in the morning. At his age, we want to be cautious. Tom nodded, processing information that felt both crucial and surreal. "Can I see him?" "He's been asking for you, actually." Room 247. Tom made his way through corridors that smelled like disinfectant and institutional food, past rooms where other families were dealing with their own medical crises. When he reached Earl's room, he found his father awake but looking exhausted, his eyes tracking to the doorway as Tom entered. "Didn't expect you to come," Earl said, his voice hoarse but steady. "Dr. Chun called. Said you collapsed at the vet clinic." Earl managed a weak smile. Honey was having a good day. Wanted to spend some extra time with her. Maybe take her for a longer walk than usual. Guess my body had other plans. Tom pulled a chair close to the bed, struck by how the hospital setting stripped away all the complications between them and left only the basic fact of their relationship. Earl was his father, the only family he had left, and the years of silence suddenly seemed less important than the monitors tracking his heartbeat. "The doctor says it was mild, that you should be okay with some rest and medication adjustments." "Maybe. At my age, mild is still a warning shot." Earl studied Tom's face in the dim light from the hallway. "Question is, what happens to Honey if something happens to me? She's gotten attached, and I'd hate to think of her ending up." Earl stopped himself, but Tom understood what he'd been about to say. Ending up abandoned again, like she had been before. The irony was cruel but unmistakable. Earl was worried about the same thing Tom had done, the possibility that Honey might be left without anyone willing to care for her. "She won't," Tom said quietly. "If something happens to you, I'll take care of her." The words surprised them both. Tom hadn't planned to make that commitment, hadn't consciously decided to take responsibility for the dog he'd abandoned. But sitting in the hospital room, watching his father struggle with mortality and the fear of leaving Honey vulnerable, the promise felt like the only decent response possible. Earl searched his son's face, looking for signs of sincerity or reservation. "That's a big commitment, son." "Her medical care alone. I'll figure it out." Tom's voice was stronger now, carrying conviction that felt real even to himself. "However long she needs care, whatever it costs, I'll find a way." Something shifted in Earl's expression, a subtle relaxation that suggested relief mixed with surprise. For the first time in their adult relationship, Tom had made a promise that prioritized someone else's welfare over his own convenience, and Earl seemed to recognize the significance of that change. "She's sleeping at Dr. Chun's tonight," Earl said, "probably wondering where I am. I can pick her up tomorrow, bring her by to visit when you're feeling stronger." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the soft beeping of monitors and the distant sounds of hospital activity. Tom found himself studying his father's face, noting the changes that 15 years of separation had created. Earl looked older, obviously, but also somehow more at peace than Tom remembered from their younger years together. "Dad," Tom said, finally, using the word consciously for the first time in years, "I'm sorry. For everything, the funeral, the things I said, the years of not talking. And I'm sorry about Honey, about what I did, about making you clean up my mess." Earl's eyes were closing, fatigue and medication taking their toll, but he squeezed Tom's hand with surprising strength. "We'll talk more when I'm home," Earl said softly. "But for now, knowing you'll take care of her if I can't, that's enough." "That's more than enough." Tom spent the night in the hospital waiting room, dozing fitfully in an uncomfortable chair, while nurses made their rounds and the building settled into the quiet rhythm of institutional care. When morning came, he felt emotionally wrung out but strangely clear-headed, as if the crisis had burned away some of the confusion that had been clouding his judgment for months. Earl was discharged the following afternoon with a prescription for heart medication and strict instructions about rest and stress management. Tom drove him home in careful silence, both men aware that their relationship had shifted during the long hospital night, but uncertain how to navigate this new territory. "Honey's still at Dr. Chun's," Earl said, as Tom helped him into the house. "Figured I should get settled before we bring her home." The word "we" hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither man addressed directly. But Tom understood that something fundamental had changed during Earl's hospitalization, that his promise to care for Honey had opened a door that had been closed for 15 years. They retrieved Honey from the veterinary clinic that evening, and Tom was struck by the dog's obvious joy at seeing Earl again. She pressed against his legs with the kind of desperate affection that spoke to genuine attachment, her tail wagging so vigorously that her entire body seemed to vibrate with happiness. But what surprised Tom was Honey's reaction to his presence. Instead of the fear or resentment he might have expected, she approached him with cautious curiosity, sniffing his hands and allowing him to pet her head when Earl encouraged the interaction. "She's a forgiving soul," Earl observed, watching the careful dance of recognition between Tom and the dog he'd abandoned. "Probably remembers you, but she's willing to start over if you are." Over the following days, Tom found himself spending more time at Earl's house, initially to help with his father's recovery, but increasingly because both Earl and Honey seemed to benefit from his presence. Earl tired easily and needed assistance with tasks that had become difficult since his heart attack, while Honey required the kind of consistent care that was challenging for someone with Earl's reduced mobility. Tom began staying overnight several times a week, sleeping in his old bedroom and taking responsibility for Honey's morning walks and evening medications. The arrangement felt strange at first. He hadn't lived in his childhood home for over 20 years, but gradually it began to feel natural, even necessary. Working together to care for Honey forced Earl and Tom into conversations they'd been avoiding for years. While measuring out the dog's heart medication or preparing her special diet, they found themselves talking about Margaret's death, about the things they'd both said and failed to say during those difficult months after the funeral. "I was angry," Tom admitted one evening as they sat in Earl's workshop, Honey sleeping peacefully between them. "Not just at you, but at everything. At God for taking her, at the doctors for not catching it sooner, and myself for not spending more time with her before she got sick." Earl was working on a small repair project, his hands moving with the sure competence that had defined his professional life. "Anger's easier than grief sometimes. Gives you something to focus on besides the loss. I blamed you for not making her go to the doctor sooner, for being too stubborn about medical care. But I think I was really mad at myself for not being there more, for not seeing the signs. We both missed things we shouldn't have missed," Earl said quietly. "Your mother was good at hiding when she didn't feel well, didn't want to worry us. By the time the symptoms were obvious, it was already too late for the kind of treatment that might have made a difference." These conversations happened gradually, in fragments spread across weeks of shared responsibility for Honey's care. Neither man pushed for dramatic reconciliation or emotional catharsis. Instead, they let understanding develop naturally through the mundane tasks of daily life. Tom began to see his father differently during this period, recognizing qualities that had been obscured by years of resentment and misunderstanding. Earl's stoicism, which Tom had always interpreted as emotional distance, revealed itself as a form of strength that allowed him to remain steady during crises. His preference for action over words wasn't coldness, but a practical approach to problem solving that had served their family well during difficult times. Most importantly, Tom began to understand that Earl's love had always been expressed through service rather than sentiment, through the things he built and fixed and provided rather than through declarations of affection. The workshop behind the house wasn't a retreat from family responsibilities, but a place where Earl had created the financial stability that allowed Tom and Margaret to feel secure. One evening in December, as they sat watching Honey sleep by the fireplace, Earl reached into his pocket and pulled out Margaret's wedding ring, the same ring he'd offered Tom during their confrontation at the veterinary clinic. "She would have been proud of what you're doing," Earl said, holding the ring between them. "Taking care of an animal you didn't have to care for, helping an old man who didn't make it easy to love him. That's the kind of person she raised you to be." Tom accepted the ring with hands that trembled slightly, slipping it onto his pinky finger where it caught the light from the fire. The weight of it felt significant, not just as a piece of jewelry, but as a symbol of continuity between generations, of love that persisted despite imperfect expression. "I want to tell people," Tom said suddenly, "about Honey, about what I did. I'm tired of you getting credit for fixing my mistake." Earl was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on Honey's sleeping form. "That's your choice to make," he said. "Finally. But consider whether the telling would help anyone or just make you feel better about carrying the secret. People should know the truth. Truth's more complicated than most people want to admit. The truth is, you made a mistake when you were desperate and scared. The truth is also that you came back, that you're here now taking care of her when it would be easier to walk away again. Which truth matters more depends on what you're trying to accomplish." Tom looked down at his mother's ring, considering Earl's words and the implications of public confession. The social media storm had died down somewhat, but Earl's reputation as a local hero remained intact. Revealing Tom's role in Honey's abandonment would destroy that reputation and probably subject both men to public judgment they didn't deserve. But more than that, Tom was beginning to understand that redemption wasn't about public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. It was about choosing differently when faced with similar circumstances, about proving through actions rather than words that growth was possible. "Maybe you're right," Tom said. "Maybe what matters is what happens next, not what people think about what happened before." Earl nodded, reaching over to scratch behind Honey's ears. "She's forgiven you," he said simply. "Sometimes that's enough to build on." 6 months after Earl's heart attack, Tom moved back into his childhood home permanently. The decision wasn't dramatic or ceremonial. It evolved naturally from the practical needs of caring for both his father and Honey. From the recognition, the small apartment on Elm Street had been a symbol of defeat rather than independence. Earl's recovery had been steady but incomplete. His cardiologist had been clear about the limitations his heart condition would impose, the activities he'd need to modify or abandon entirely. At 82, with a history of heart disease, Earl faced a future that required careful management and reliable support. The kind of daily assistance that neighbors could provide temporarily, but that family needed to sustain long-term. Tom had been surprised by how naturally he'd settled back into the rhythms of the house where he'd grown up. His old bedroom felt smaller than he remembered, but the view from the window was exactly the same. The backyard where Margaret had tended her flowers, the workshop where Earl had spent countless hours building and repairing things for neighbors who'd valued his skill with engines and electrical systems. Honey had thrived with both men caring for her health stabilizing under the consistent routine they'd established together. Her morning walks with Tom had become a neighborhood fixture, familiar enough that people set their clocks by the sight of them heading down Maple Street toward the park. Her evening medications were Earl's responsibility, administered with the same careful precision he'd once applied to timing engine repairs. The arrangement benefited all three of them in ways that went beyond practical necessity. Earl had someone to share meals with, to help with tasks that had become difficult since his heart attack. Tom had escaped the isolation and bitterness that had defined his life in the apartment, rediscovering aspects of himself that he'd thought were permanently lost. And Honey had what every dog deserves: a stable home with people who considered her welfare a priority rather than a burden. Spring brought changes that none of them had anticipated. Earl's reputation as a local hero had opened doors to volunteer opportunities with the Cedar Falls Animal Rescue, where his workshop skills proved valuable for building kennels and play equipment. Tom found himself joining these projects, initially to help Earl, but increasingly because he enjoyed the work and the sense of purpose it provided. Their collaboration on rescue projects led to something Earl had been hoping for since Tom's return, teaching his son the mechanical skills that had defined Earl's professional life. In the workshop behind the house, surrounded by tools that had been organized the same way for 40 years, Earl began passing on knowledge that represented decades of problem-solving and craftsmanship. "Every engine tells a story," Earl said one afternoon as he watched Tom rebuild a carburetor for a rescue organization's transport van. "You just have to listen carefully enough to hear what it's trying to tell you." Tom's hands had developed a steady confidence that came from practice and good instruction. Working beside his father, learning techniques that Earl had perfected over decades of professional experience, he began to understand the satisfaction that came from fixing things that other people had given up on. "I should have paid attention to this when I was younger," Tom said, adjusting the carburetor's float level with the careful precision Earl had taught him. "You weren't ready then." Sometimes people need to break a few things before they appreciate the value of knowing how to fix them. The comment wasn't specifically about mechanical repair, and both men understood the deeper implications. Tom's journey from abandoning Honey to caring for her, from estrangement with Earl to collaboration and mutual support, had been a process of learning how to fix relationships that seemed beyond repair. By summer, their routine had become so established that it felt as though it had always existed. Tom had transferred to the Cedar Falls branch of his auto parts company, accepting a slight pay cut in exchange for shorter commute times and more flexibility to help with Earl's medical appointments. He'd begun taking classes at the community college to formalize his mechanical training, with plans to eventually open his own repair business using Earl's workshop as a base. Honey's role in their daily life had evolved as well. She'd become something of a therapy dog at the animal rescue, her calm presence helping to socialize nervous animals and providing comfort to volunteers dealing with difficult cases. Dr. Sarah Chum had remarked on how much happier Honey seemed compared to her condition when Earl first brought her in, noting that she'd gained weight and energy, along with a sense of security that showed in her relaxed demeanor. "She knows she's home," Sarah had observed during one of Honey's regular checkups. "Dogs are good at recognizing when they're truly wanted rather than just tolerated." The observation had resonated with Tom, who'd begun to understand that the same recognition applied to people. Living with Earl, working together on projects that mattered to both of them, he'd rediscovered the feeling of being genuinely wanted rather than simply endured. The bitterness and isolation that had defined his life after the divorce had been replaced by something he'd almost forgotten was possible: contentment. One evening in late August, as they sat on the front porch watching Honey explore the flower beds Margaret had planted years ago, Earl brought up the subject that neither of them had addressed directly since Tom's return. "You know, people still talk about the story," Earl said, referring to the media attention that had surrounded Honey's rescue. "Local hero saves abandoned dog, that sort of thing. Sometimes I wonder if we should set the record straight." Tom considered this, watching Honey nose around the marigolds that had been Margaret's favorites. A social media storm had long since moved on to other stories, but Earl's reputation as a compassionate rescuer remained intact in the community's memory. "I think the story they tell is true enough," Tom said finally. "Maybe not factually complete, but true in the ways that matter. You did save her, just not the way people think. And maybe saving me in the process wasn't intentional, but it happened anyway." Earl nodded, understanding what Tom meant. The official version of events, Earl finding and rescuing an abandoned dog, missed the complexity of what had actually occurred, but it captured the essential truth about redemption and second chances. "Your mother always said the best stories," are the ones where broken things get fixed, Earl said. She would have liked how this one turned out. As the sun set over Cedar Falls, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Tom of countless evenings from his childhood, he felt the profound satisfaction that comes from understanding that some mistakes can be transformed into opportunities for grace. Honey dozed at their feet, secure in the knowledge that she was loved and wanted. Earl sat comfortably beside his son, grateful for the unexpected gift of reconciliation in his final years. And Tom, who had once been the kind of man who abandoned a loyal dog because caring for her had become inconvenient, had become the kind of man who chose love even when it cost him something, who stayed even when staying was hard. The transformation hadn't happened through dramatic gesture or sudden epiphany, but through the quiet accumulation of better choices, day after day, until being the kind of person his mother had raised him to be felt natural again. Some stories, he reflected, don't end so much as they settle into the rhythm of a life well lived, where love is measured not in grand declarations, but in the consistency of daily care, the reliability of presence, the choice to stay when staying matters most.